Imagine for a second that you're holding a camera. What you actually capture and how you understand the scene right in front of you depends entirely on the lens you choose to use, right? Do you snap on a macro lens to zoom in incredibly tight on a single isolated flower? Or do you swap that out for a wide-angle lens to capture the whole meadow, the shifting sunlight, and the approaching storm? Well, in the world of modern therapy, this choice of lens literally changes everything.
So I really want you to think about this question. When someone is struggling, say with depression, crippling anxiety, or a serious behavioral issue, where does that problem actually live? Does it exist completely inside that person's biology or brain chemistry? Or does it live in the spaces between people, in their relationships, their families, their broader ecosystems? The way a counselor answers that single question dictates the entire path of therapy.
Okay, here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. 2 views of therapy. 2. The individual counseling lens. 3. The systemic counseling lens. 4. Individual diagnostic assessments. 5. Systemic diagnostic assessments. And 6. The impact of the shift. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. 2 views of therapy. Shifting the clinical lens.
To really grasp this shift, we have to talk about what clinicians call an epistemological base. Now, I know epistemological sounds a bit academic, but it really just means a person's foundational blueprint for how they understand knowledge and problems. Every single therapist operates from one of these bases. The fundamental core divide here is whether you focus on the self or focus on transactions. Basically, do you isolate an individual to figure out what's internally broken, or do you look at the constant back-and-forth ping-pong of interactions between people? The traditional view isolates. The modern systems view connects.
Section 2. The individual counseling lens, zooming in on the self.
Let's start with the approach most of us are already familiar with, which is rooted in the traditional medical model. Picture that macro lens we talked about earlier. It's zoomed in so tightly on a single subject that the rest of the world is completely blurred out. In this model, the entire focus is on the self, development, and internal coping mechanisms. The counselor views the person in isolation from their systems. Honestly, by doing this, they're making a massive bet. They're betting that their 1 hour of therapy each week is somehow going to magically outweigh all the other relational influences happening in that client's life 24/7. The counselor acts as the objective expert. Find the root cause inside the person and fix it.
Section 3. The systemic counseling lens, zooming out to the ecosystem.
But what happens when we swap the lens? When we zoom out to capture the whole ecosystem surrounding our subject? This brings us to a radically different way to look at human pain. Systemic epistemology is built on the belief that a person is completely inseparable from their system. We're social creatures. In this view, the actual site of the pathology, the real root of the problem, isn't just locked away inside someone's head. It's in the system itself. It's all about mutual influence, how I affect you, how your reaction then affects me in this totally endless loop.
Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory maps this out beautifully. We don't live in vacuums. We're embedded in these nested layers of influence, kind of like Russian dolls. You've got your immediate microsystem, family, close friends. Then the mesosystem, where those circles intersect. Wider still is the exosystem of the community and the massive macrosystem of our societal culture. Wrapping it all up is the chronosystem, which is how everything shifts over time. Systemic therapy gets that if a stressor violently shakes one of those outer rings, the inner rings are going to rattle too.
So the hallmarks of this approach totally flip the traditional script. Systemic counselors care way more about process over content. It's not necessarily about what you're arguing about, like who left the dishes in the sink. It's about how you argue, the sequence of the transaction. They even view a client's symptoms as serving a systemic purpose, sometimes maintaining a weird sort of balance in a dysfunctional family. And remember, a systemic therapist might invite the whole family into the room, but it's not a headcount thing. It's because they're dedicated to treating the entire relational field.
Section 4. Individual diagnostic assessments. The hunt for pathology.
Now, these sweeping philosophical differences aren't just hypotheticals. They literally collide during step 1 of therapy, the diagnostic assessment. Let's look at how the individual lens hunts for pathology. Using a traditional epistemology, a counselor relies on combining isolated observations to find symptoms that perfectly match the DSM-5 criteria. Basically, the clinician is looking for a label. They want to define exactly what is quote-unquote broken inside the client by measuring them against standard psychopathology.
As foundational texts, like James Robert Bitter's work on couples and family counseling point out, this is often the single hardest adjustment for Western-trained counselors.
We are so heavily conditioned by the medical model to hunt for individual pathology that stepping back to assess relational functionality, well, it can feel like trying to learn a totally alien language.
Section 5. Systemic Diagnostic Assessments, Mapping the Network.
So, how does a systemic therapist assess that exact same struggling client? They put away the macro lens, snap on the wide angle, and instead of hunting for an internal disorder, they map the network. Instead of leaning purely on the DSM-5, they might use tools like the GARF, the Global Assessment of Relational Functioning. See the massive difference there? They are actually measuring the health and functionality of the relationship itself, the dynamic between partners or between parent and child, because in this room, the relationship is the patient.
The systemic assessment process is highly active. The counselor observes who actually holds the power in the family structure. They trace problematic interaction patterns. For instance, if a teenage acts out, what does the mom do? What does the dad do in response to the mom? The therapist traces this rapid-fire chain reaction until they find what the family considers their normal, even if that normal is incredibly painful. Usually, the family can't even see this mutually reinforcing loop until the therapist maps it out for them, often sketching it out with a visual family genogram.
Section 6. The impact of the shift. The case of Anne.
We've covered a lot of theory, but what does this mean for a real person? Let's take a hypothetical client named Anne, who's dealing with depression. If Anne goes to an individual counselor, she gets a DSM-5 diagnosis, starts one-on-one therapy, and the focus is on her internal cognitions to help her cope with her environment. But if Anne sees a systemic counselor, they're exploring her family process. They're likely inviting her family in. They focus on the relationships actively maintaining her depression, and they intervene to change those transactions. Do you see it? One helps Anne survive her ecosystem, the other tries to change the ecosystem itself.
And that brings us to the ultimate why behind the systemic philosophy. Gerald Corey nails it in the source material when he says, an individual's systemic affiliations and interactions have more power in the person's life than a single counselor could ever hope to have. Intervening in the system isn't just a quirky alternative technique. It dramatically increases the odds that when a person finally makes a positive change, their environment will actually support it, rather than just dragging them right back into old, painful habits.
It completely reframes how you look at your own life, doesn't it? We're not just isolated islands. We're all part of this massive, breathing, interconnected web. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you face a persistent challenge or you find yourself totally stuck in a rut, are you only going to look inward to see what's quote-unquote wrong with you, or will you zoom out and look at the systems and relationships around you? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and always keep looking at the big picture.